The ridge was a knife laid bare to the sky, scoured clean by wind that never got tired and snow that came sideways like thrown sand. Headlamps bobbed in a thin line behind the veteran handler, their beams swallowed and returned in pale shreds by the spindrift. Every sound was either breathing trapped in fabric or the hard, dry clack of metal against metal. Carabiners kissing harness rings, radio mics bumping jackets. Small noises trying to convince everyone this was still a search, still routine, still something you could finish and file away. The handler didn't talk much. He didn't have to. His posture did the speaking, shoulders squared against the gusts, gloved hands steady on the lead, eyes scanning the ridge for what the mountain would give up and what it would keep. The dog moved just ahead of him, compact and deliberate, the kind of animal that didn't waste steps or attention. Its coat was dusted white, its breath puffed in clean bursts. Then, without warning, the dog stopped so hard the lead snapped taut. Not a stumble, not hesitation. A full lock, muscles braced, head low, nose lifted just enough to catch what the wind was smuggling past. The team behind them instinctively halted, boots crunching once and then going still. Snow streamed over the cornice in ribbons, erasing edges, making the ridge look like it was flowing. A young volunteer, too cheerful, voice too loud for the altitude, gave a short laugh. "Probably a rabbit under there," he said, pointing into the whiteout where the ridge dipped into a shallow basin. The joke landed wrong. The handler didn't even turn. He watched the dog's ears, the set of its shoulders, the tiny tremor of focus that meant the world had narrowed to one point. The dog's stare didn't wander. It fixed on a shape that the human eye kept trying to downgrade into weather. A drift, a shadow, a harmless fold in the snow. Another gust tore through, and for half a second the drift looked different, like a surface stretched over something that refused to be flat. The dog's lips pulled back just enough to show restraint instead of rage, and a growl rolled out, low, controlled, not a warning for wildlife, but a message for people. Stop. The volunteer's grin faded. The rope tech shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. The deputy assigned to coordinate cleared his throat as if authority could warm his lungs. "We keep moving," he said. And the handler finally spoke, voice calm, final. "No." One syllable, quiet as a pin drop, louder than the wind because it didn't argue. The dog stepped forward and then sideways, placing its body across the narrow path like a living barricade, tail rigid, eyes locked on the basin. It wasn't lunging. It wasn't panicking. It was guarding a threshold. The handler eased his hand down the lead, not pulling, not pushing, just giving the animal room to work. He knelt, palm pressed to the crusted snow, feeling vibration, density, the subtle lie of the surface. The wind hissed. The team watched, caught between impatience and the animal certainty they'd learned, sometimes grudgingly, to respect. Somewhere down the ridge, a radio squawked and cut off as if someone had leaned on the channel. The handler's gaze sharpened, not just on the snow, but on the human faces behind him, on the deputy's tight jaw, on the volunteer's sudden silence, on the way one of the extra men at the back kept angling his phone away from the group. And that's the moment you need to hold on to, because it wasn't just a dog reacting to scent on a mountain. It was a trained sentinel recognizing a wrongness that didn't belong to storms or cliffs. Right there, high on that wind-cut ridge, with the world reduced to white noise and breath. They were about to realize they weren't searching for a lost hiker at all. They were walking into a crime scene, and the snow was trying to hide it. An hour earlier, the mountain had almost seemed merciful. The kind of quiet that makes people believe in order. Order again, dawn spreading a pale gold wash over pine needles and granite faces as if the world had been carefully arranged overnight. The staging area sat at the edge of timberline where the trees still stood dense enough to break the wind, and every surface wore a thin armor of frost. Rope fibers stiff with rime, helmet straps crusted white, the metal teeth of crampons glittering like small threats. Radios muttered in low bursts, half sentences and static, the sound of a distant argument carried through walls. The veteran handler checked his gear the same way he always did. Not with showmanship, not with the eager flourish of someone who wanted to be seen doing it, but with a quiet diligence that came from years of being the last line between a person and the worst day of their life. He counted carabiners by feel, ran his glove along the rope for burrs, tapped the battery pack twice like a habit that never lost its meaning. His face didn't advertise what he'd lived through. It held that calm, sealed quality some people mistake for coldness until they realize it's discipline, a practiced refusal to waste emotion where it can't help. When others spoke in adrenaline, stories, theories, complaints about the cold, he answered in short, useful phrases. Copy. Hold. We'll see. Not because he didn't care, but because caring for him meant getting it right. At his heel sat the dog, still as a statue until the handler's fingers brushed the collar. Then the animal's attention snapped into alignment. Eyes bright, ears forward, muscles coiled with readiness that never spilled into chaos. It wasn't the kind of dog people asked to pet. Nothing about it invited casualness. Its gaze didn't linger on snacks or strangers. It read terrain, read faces, read the air itself like a page. The handler didn't talk to it like a child. He spoke to it like a partner. One-word commands, soft and precise, the language of trust built under pressure. Around them, the local volunteer crew milled with the restless energy of people trying to prove they belonged in the cold. And a few officials hovered near a table of maps and thermoses, their jackets branded in ways that announced status more than function. Past the staging lights, down the access road, you could just make out the private lodge through the trees. Dark windows, heavy gates, a clean line of plowed snow that ended abruptly at a no-entry sign, polished like it had been kissed by money. It was the kind of place that sold winter as an experience, that treated the mountain like a product and the season, short, lucrative, unforgiving, as something that must not be disrupted. People in town didn't say it loudly, not in front of radios and uniforms. But whispers had been threading through the community for weeks. Another accident on a service road, another slip near a restricted slope, another person who'd arrived full of plans and left in a box, or not at all. The handler had heard the whispers, the way you hear thunder far off. No proof yet, but a pattern that makes you pay attention. He'd also noticed the tension at the edges of conversations. The way a shopkeeper's smile tightened when the lodge was mentioned. The way a deputy's eyes flicked away too fast when someone asked about boundaries. The way certain locals suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere when search teams came into town. None of it was enough to accuse. It was enough to prepare. The handler clipped the lead and stood. Not for applause, not for bravado, but because a call had come in and someone was missing. And the only moral math he trusted was simple. If you can help, you go. The dog rose with him, disciplined, silent, a sentinel with fur. And together they stepped into the morning as the mountain watched, beautiful and indifferent. While somewhere below, behind gates and polished signs, something about this search was already trying to steer them away from the truth. By the time the first briefing circle formed, the calm of dawn had been replaced by the restless heat of human urgency. The kind that doesn't warm you, just makes you sweat under layers. Maps were spread over a tailgate and pinned down with gloved fists, corners snapping in the breeze like impatient flags. A dispatcher's voice crackled from a portable speaker, repeating the same facts as if repetition could make them safer. Young seasonal worker, early 20s, last seen before sunrise, assigned to maintenance, clocked out, but never made it back to housing. The final known location was a stain on the map near the lodge's restricted access road, a clean plowed strip that cut between trees and then vanished behind a gate. In a place like this, restricted didn't just mean dangerous terrain. It meant money, liability, and people who didn't like questions. The handler stood slightly outside the circle, listening with that stillness that unnerved people who needed everyone else to mirror their panic. Beside him, the dog sat, posture perfect, head tracking not the map but the faces. Volunteers shifted from foot to foot, eager to be useful, eager to be seen. A couple of locals hovered at the edge, hands in pockets, eyes darting like birds. Then the lodge arrived. You could feel it before you saw it. The hush that falls when someone powerful enters a space and expects the air to make room. The antagonist stepped out of a clean vehicle with heated seats and tinted windows, coat immaculate, boots too new to have real stories. He carried himself like the mountain belonged to him, like everyone else was a temporary inconvenience. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. People did it for him in subtle ways, the quick straightening of backs, the sudden carefulness in speech, the way a junior official moved aside without thinking. His voice cut through the group with practiced ease, loud enough to be heard, friendly enough to pass as concern, sharpened at the edges where it mattered. "We appreciate you all coming out," he said, smiling like a camera was already rolling. "But let's be realistic. The kid was new, right? Seasonal, no experience. Maybe he wandered where he shouldn't." He pointed at the map, tapping the restricted road with a finger that looked like it had never met cold. "That area is off limits for a reason." A volunteer started to speak, something about routes, grid patterns. But the man steamrolled him with a chuckle. "And now we've got an entire operation spun up," he continued, widening his arms as if embracing the absurdity. "Helicopters on standby, overtime, equipment. For what? A young man who probably decided to take a shortcut and learned a hard lesson?" The words landed like slaps dressed up as logic. Someone's jaw tightened. Someone else stared down at their boots. The missing worker's name, spoken once in the briefing, was suddenly reduced to the kid, a cautionary tale instead of a person. The antagonist's eyes flicked to the handler, measuring him, and the smile shifted into something almost playful. "And you," he said, voice still loud, still public. "I've heard about your methods. Very careful, very slow. We can't afford slow out here. Not during peak season." There it was, the humiliation play, turning the search into a performance and casting the handler as the obstacle. The deputy coordinator gave a weak laugh, like a man trying to keep both sides happy. A couple of volunteers followed along, not because they agreed, but because they didn't know what else to do with the tension. Bystanders froze in that familiar human paralysis, the fear of standing up and becoming the next target. The handler didn't rise to it. He adjusted a strap on his pack as if the comment had been weather, not venom. When he finally met the antagonist's eyes, his expression was unreadable. No anger, no defensiveness, just an even gaze that refused to be moved by theatrics. "We go where the evidence takes us," he said, calm as stone. "We move fast when it's smart, not when it's loud." The antagonist's smile twitched, a micro crack, then returned brighter. "Evidence," he repeated, tasting the word like it was optional. "Sure. Just remember who's responsible for this place." The handler didn't answer. He didn't need to. The dog, however, shifted, only slightly. Ears angling toward the antagonist, eyes narrowing with a focus that felt uncomfortably intelligent. It watched the clean jacket, the polished boots, the way the man's hand hovered near the deputy's shoulder like ownership. And in that silent, disciplined stare, the animal seemed to file away a truth the humans were too polite or too afraid to say aloud. This wasn't just a search. This was a contest over narrative, over control, over what would be allowed to be found. The moment Boots left the staging area and bit into the first incline, the search took on a shape that didn't fit the terrain. Like a map drawn by someone who'd never stood in real weather. And the handler felt it in the same place he'd felt incoming fire years ago. An absence of logic where logic should be. The grid plan was clean on paper, but out on the mountain the routes were suggested, with a gentleness that carried weight. Avoid the service road cut, stay off the north-facing slope, don't push toward the lodge boundary until later, not yet, not without clearance. Each suggestion arrived through the radio like a hand on the back, steering you away from a door you hadn't even tried to open. "Team 2, angle west, keep to the tree line," the deputy coordinator said, voice thin with forced confidence. "Team 1, maintain altitude, bypass the basin," came the follow-up. Oddly specific, oddly urgent, as if the basin itself was radioactive. The handler glanced at the deputy's profile as they moved, saw the tight swallow, the way his eyes kept flicking to his handset like it might bite. And it read like a man being managed from somewhere else. Ahead, volunteers chatted in short bursts to fight nerves. But the conversation kept dying whenever the radios spoke. Each transmission a small correction to their instincts. The dog trotted at the handler's knee, then surged forward on scent. Then, strangely, angled back, pulling in a tight arc toward the same quadrant again and again, as if it had encountered a sentence it couldn't stop rereading. The handler let it, giving the lead slack, watching the dog's nose work the wind. The animal wasn't confused. It was certain. It would move out 20 yards, stop, test the air, then pivot back toward a line of trees that stood like a dark fence below the lodge road. "He wants that way," a volunteer muttered, half amused, half annoyed, as if discipline were stubbornness. "He's circling," another said, trying to make it sound like a flaw in training rather than a warning. The handler didn't correct them. He saved his voice for moments that mattered. He watched the snow for sign, scuffs, drag marks, a disturbed crust, and kept finding nothing where there should have been something. It wasn't just that the mountain was quiet. It was that the quiet felt curated. Hard cut. The antagonist in the warmth of his vehicle. Phone pressed to his ear, the window cracked just enough to hear his tone shift from public concern to private command. "No, they're out," he said, eyes scanning the search teams like pieces on a board. "Keep them off that side. Tell him weather risk. Liability, whatever. Just not there." The person on the other end didn't speak loudly enough to hear, but the antagonist's smile returned as if he'd been reassured. Cut back. The deputy coordinator stepping slightly away from the group to answer his own phone, shoulders hunched, speaking in a low voice that didn't match his earlier authority. "Yes, sir," he said at least twice, and when he came back his cheeks were red from cold or shame. "New directive," he announced, too fast. "We're tightening perimeter. We're not to approach the lodge gate or the service cut. Focus on public trail corridors." The words hit the volunteers like a wall. No one challenged it. People looked at each other and looked away, because challenging it meant choosing a side. Somewhere behind them, half hidden among the trees at the edge of the staging area. A bystander raised a phone and didn't lower it. Not after the briefing. Not after the loud man's performance. The handler caught a glimpse of the screen as they passed. A frozen frame of the antagonist pointing at the map. The insinuation captured in pixels. The witness didn't speak. He just kept recording, thumb hovering over upload like a trigger. Back on the slope, the dog circled again, a tight loop that ended with its nose aimed toward that same forbidden area. And this time it stopped and looked up at the handler, eyes hard, as if asking why the humans were pretending not to understand. The handler felt something cold settle behind his ribs. Not fear exactly, more like the recognition of a pattern. When institutions start issuing gentle suggestions in a crisis, it's rarely about safety. It's about control. He keyed his mic, voice steady. "Requesting permission to check the basin below the service cut," he said, making it formal, making it recorded. Static hissed, and the deputy's answer came back too quick. "Negative. Not authorized." The handler stared into the white, then down at his dog, who was already pulling again, patient but insistent. In the distance, the lodge sat behind the trees, silent and expensive. And the handler understood with sick clarity that there were watchers on this mountain. People who were not searching, but monitoring, and that the dog had found a truth the radios were trying to bury. They reached the basin the way you reach any forbidden place, without announcing it, without asking permission from voices that had already made it clear they weren't interested in truth. The handler waited for a lull in radio chatter, then angled his team slightly off the approved line under the pretense of contouring around a windfall. And the dog took that inch like it had been offered a mile, pulling them down into a shallow bowl carved by winter storms. The air changed immediately. The wind still ran over the ridge above. But down here, it moved in confused currents, eddying in pockets that held scent the way a room holds smoke. Snow lay thick and hard-packed, a crust the color of old bone, the surface textured with wind ripples, except for one section near the center where the pattern broke. It wasn't obvious at first. That was the dangerous part. Nature hides its seams well. But the dog found it like it was a bright thread in fabric, nose hovering inches above the ground, pace slowing into measured steps until it stopped at the edge of a line that didn't belong. The handler crouched, heart not pounding but tightening with that familiar professional focus. The moment when the world shrinks to details, and every detail starts speaking. He swept his headlamp beam along the basin floor. Wind-packed snow should be uniform here, scoured and refrozen, the same crust from edge to edge. Yet there it was, a faint, unnatural seam running in a shallow arc. Like someone had drawn a boundary, not with ink but with effort. On one side, the snow was rough, granular, littered with tiny trapped twigs and flecks of bark carried down from above. On the other, it was smoother, almost polished, as if it had been tamped and brushed. Reset. Like a bed made in a hurry after a struggle. The handler sank to his knees, ignoring the sting as the cold seeped through his pads and pressed a gloved palm to the surface. The texture told him more than his eyes. The rough side resisted with the stubborn brittleness of wind-sculpted crust. The smooth side gave just a fraction, softer beneath, layered wrong, as if older snow had been disturbed and then covered with a fresh skin. He traced the seam with his fingertips, following it until it disappeared under a thin veil of drifted powder. The dog's body was rigid beside him, ears forward, breath quiet, as if even exhaling too loudly might disturb whatever lay under this lie. Behind them, one of the volunteers shifted, boots crunching, and the handler lifted a hand without looking. Stop. The man froze mid-step. Silence stretched, broken only by distant wind and the faint mosquito whine of a radio someone had forgotten to fully mute. The handler's gaze swept again. Tighter now. That's when he saw it. A sliver of dark fabric half buried near the seam, so small it could have been dismissed as forest debris if you wanted to keep believing the mountain was in charge. He leaned in and brushed away a dusting of snow with the edge of his glove, careful not to disturb the surrounding crust. The object emerged in a sharp little close-up of reality. A torn strap, cheap webbing frayed at the end, snapped like it had been yanked hard. Attached to it, a cracked plastic buckle, the kind that came on low-cost packs issued to seasonal staff. Not the kind of gear anyone on this team carried. Not the kind of thing that should be sitting here untouched in a basin no official route had included. The handler's jaw tightened. He held the strap up between two fingers, letting the headlamp catch the fibers, and felt the team behind him lean in without moving their feet. Someone whispered the missing worker's name like a prayer, and the handler didn't answer because answers were still forming. He keyed his mic, but didn't transmit yet. He listened first, waiting for radio traffic, hearing only a hiss and an occasional burst of controlled voices. He glanced back up the slope toward the ridge where the search line was supposed to be, and a cold thought landed clean and heavy. If this had been just an accident, there would be tracks. There would be a chaotic scatter. There would be the honest mess of nature doing what nature does. Instead, there was a seam, a reset surface, a single piece of man-made evidence placed where it didn't fit. The narrator could have called it coincidence, could have blamed wind, could have shrugged and moved on. But the mountain wasn't the only force shaping this scene. This wasn't nature. This was interference. The handler waited until he could speak without heat in his voice, because heat was what people like this fed on, and he wouldn't give them a meal. He lifted the torn strap exactly once for the team to see, then set it back down where he'd found it, laying a bright marker flag beside the seam like a silent accusation. Only then did he key his radio. "Found an anomaly in Basin 3, he reported, every syllable measured. Wind pack discontinuity, possible disturbance. Recovered item consistent with personal gear. Requesting supervisor response and scene hold." For a beat, there was only static, the kind that feels like the mountain itself is listening. Then the deputy coordinator's reply snapped in, too fast, too practiced. "Copy, mark it, and move on." No questions, no request for photos, no instruction to preserve, just move on. The handler stared at the handset as if it had spoken in a different language. "Negative," he answered, calm but firmer. "This requires documentation and containment. Requesting law enforcement evidence protocol." Another pause, then a new voice slid onto the channel, an administrative tone, smooth and flat. "Will note the location. Continue search operations. Do not create bottlenecks." Bottlenecks, as if truth were traffic. The handler felt his dog's lead tighten slightly, the animal's attention sharpening on the humans behind him. Not the snow now, as if it could smell the shift in intent. He turned and saw one of the officials, an unfamiliar uniform with clean patches, stepping closer with an outstretched hand. "Let me take your GPS," the man said, polite, the kind of polite that's meant to disarm. "For proper logging." The handler didn't move. "You can log from your own device," he replied. "This stays with me." The official smiled like he'd expected resistance. "Protocol," he insisted, stepping in another half step, eyes already flicking toward the unit clipped on the handler's shoulder strap. The dog slid forward with surgical precision, placing its body between the official and the handler's torso. Not aggressive, not panicked, just present, a barrier with breath. The official's smile faltered, and he tried to angle around. The dog mirrored him, shoulder to knee, closing the space without a sound. The handler's hand came down, 2 fingers touching the dog's collar in a quiet reassurance, and his gaze stayed locked on the official. "Don't," he said softly. "No one touches my equipment." A radio squawk rose and died again, like someone somewhere didn't like the way this was going. Then the wind carried a different sound. Engine noise climbing from below, the crunch of tires on compacted snow, too confident for the terrain. Heads turned. The lodgeman arrived as if summoned by the mere existence of inconvenience, stepping into the basin with 2 others trailing him, one holding a phone up like a lens, one carrying a clipboard like a shield. His jacket was still spotless. His smile was wide, broadcast ready. "There you are," he called, voice booming into the cold, the way a stage performer claims a room. "I heard you found something." He didn't wait for invitation. He walked straight toward the seam as if it belonged to him by default. The handler rose to his feet, placing himself between the man and the marker flag. The antagonist stopped close, too close, filling the handler's space with the old tactic of proximity and pressure. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound reasonable to anyone watching. "We're all on the same team here, but we need to keep this productive. The worker, kids like that, they get spooked. They run, they disappear. It happens." He spoke the narrative into existence like a spell. Ran off, irresponsible, not our fault. Behind him, the phone holder shifted angle to capture the handler's face, to frame him as the obstacle. The antagonist's smile never left, but his eyes sharpened. "You don't want to be the guy who turns a simple situation into a spectacle," he added, friendly threat wrapped in concern. The handler felt outrage flicker in his chest, hot, quick, and crushed it down into something colder and more useful. "A missing person isn't a spectacle," he said. "And a disturbed scene isn't simple." The antagonist chuckled, louder again for the camera. "Disturbed? Come on. Wind does that. Snow shifts. You know that." He spread his hands as if appealing to the group. "We have paying guests. We have safety concerns. We have liabilities. Let's not—" He stepped to the side, trying to see around the handler, trying to get to the seam. The dog moved with him, matching step for step, not barking, not snarling, just blocking, refusing space like a disciplined sentry at a checkpoint. The antagonist's eyes dropped to the dog, irritation flashing. "Control your animal," he snapped, the first crack in the mask. The handler didn't raise his voice. "He is controlled," he said. "That's why he's telling me something you don't want heard." For a second, the basin felt smaller, the sky pressing down. The snow seemed like a line between 2 worlds. The antagonist forced the smile back on. But the threat had widened now. No longer just a search against weather, but a search against people who could call themselves institutions and still treat truth like an error to be managed. The handler knew it in his bones. The intimidation had begun, and it was wearing a clean jacket. The ridge welcomed them back with violence, wind punching through layers and turning every exhale into a small, desperate cloud. But the handler's mind was clearer than it had been in the basin, because now the conflict had declared itself. There was what the mountain did, and there was what people were trying to make the mountain say. The team crested the line in single file, rope between them, spacing tight, eyes narrowed against the white glare. And that was when the dog froze exactly as it had in the first moment. Dead still, weight forward, neck rigid, gaze pinned into the blowing snow like it was watching a door open. The volunteer who'd joked earlier didn't laugh this time. His mouth hung slightly open, an unspoken apology caught behind his teeth. The deputy coordinator's boots scuffed as he tried to step around, but the handler's hand lifted and the whole column halted as if pulled by a single string. He didn't need theatrics. He didn't need a speech. He only needed to trust what he had trained for, the language of a working dog's body. The animal's ears weren't twitching at random. They were triangulating. Its nose wasn't buried. It was sampling, lifting into the turbulent airflow in short, efficient pulls, letting the wind deliver the truth in fragments. The handler followed the line of that attention like following a compass needle. The drift ahead sat just below the ridge lip, a mound that any tired eye could accept as ordinary. Wind-loaded snow, smooth curve, harmless. But the dog's stare didn't accept it, and neither did the handler anymore. He crouched, shielded his mic with his glove, and spoke one word into the dog's ear. Quiet, firm, not a plea but a key turning in a lock. Check. The dog moved instantly, not with frantic digging, but with a precise pattern that looked almost ritualistic. 3 steps left, nose up. 2 steps forward, nose down. A brief pause. Then one controlled paw scrape exactly where the scent thread seemed to snag. It wasn't searching like a pet playing in snow. It was mapping a problem. The handler watched the way the dog's shoulders shifted, the way it tested the wind, the way it refused to waste energy on the wrong spot. And he felt the reversal begin. Not as a dramatic explosion, but as the steady click of competence taking control of chaos. The dog pawed again, shallow, careful, and the snow surface broke differently there. Not in the brittle way wind packs should fracture, but in a softer collapse, like a crust over an air pocket. The handler's eyes narrowed. He knelt and brushed away loose powder with the edge of his glove, exposing a faint line. Another seam, but tighter, more deliberate, as if someone had sculpted the mound to look natural from 10 feet away. The rope tech leaned in, eyes hard now, and even the deputy's face tightened, as if he just remembered he was supposed to be a protector, not a messenger. The dog pawed once more, still controlled, and a small depression formed, snow sinking inward with a muffled whoomp that didn't belong on an open ridge. Air moved, not wind over surface, air from within. The handler put his gloved hand over the spot and felt it. A subtle exhale of cold, trapped space beneath. The drift wasn't a drift. It was a cover. "Stop," he said, voice calm but absolute. And the team stopped like a machine powered down. He switched channels on his radio, bypassing the deputy's loop, and transmitted upward with procedural clarity. Each word chosen for what it would become on record. "Possible concealed void, under snowpack at ridge coordinate," he reported. K9 indicates human scent concentration. Potential concealed person, treating as potential evidence site. Request immediate scene hold and supervisory response. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't argue with static. He looked at his team and watched the posture change in real time. The volunteers stopped fidgeting and started scanning. The rope tech shifted from helper to protector. One medic quietly pulled tape and gloves. Someone snapped photos with steady hands. Even the bystander who'd been lingering at the edge lifted a phone and began recording again, framing the scene, the dog, the handler's measured calm. The antagonist had wanted this to be a story about a reckless kid who ran off. The mountain and the dog were writing a different story now. One with a hidden cavity, a curated surface, and a truth that didn't care who owned the lodge. As the handler positioned himself over the mound like a human shield, and the dog held its ground beside him, silent and immovable, the power dynamic flipped. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with visibility and procedure. The kind of quiet authority that turns bullies into bystanders and forces institutions to choose which side of the line they stand on. The response came faster than it should have, as if the command chain had been waiting with its finger already on the button. "Stand down!" A clipped voice snapped through the radio, not the deputy's. Higher, colder, the sound of someone used to telling truth where it may and may not go. "Do not disturb the area. Wait for authorization." The handler stared at the handset for half a beat, taking in the phrasing. Wait, authorization, do not disturb. As if the priority were protecting paperwork from fingerprints, not protecting a human being from whatever lay under that sculpted mound. Behind him, the ridge wind rose in pitch, and the sky, which had been pale and open, began to bruise with fast-moving cloud. Perfect timing. The kind of timing that always looks natural if you want it to. "Weather's turning," another voice layered in, urgent now, crowding the channel. "Storm advisory just issued. All teams withdraw to staging. Repeat, withdraw." The deputy coordinator stepped forward, face tight, eyes darting anywhere but the mound. "You heard them," he said, too loud over the wind, projecting obedience as leadership. "We have to clear the ridge. It's unsafe." Unsafe was a word people used to end conversations, a moral off switch. The handler didn't move. He looked at the mound, at the dog braced beside it, then at the nervous deputy, and said evenly, "Unsafe for who?" The question hung there, sharp as ice. The deputy's mouth opened and closed. Static hissed. Somewhere down the slope, an engine growled. A vehicle climbing where it had no business climbing this fast. The rope tech turned his head, squinting into the white. And the handler felt the team's cohesion tighten like a knot. The vehicle crested below them, tires churning snow, and stopped at the narrow cut that served as their easiest exit, parked sideways like a deliberate mistake. A big, clean SUV, too heavy, too confident, blocking egress with the plausible deniability of oops. A man in a branded jacket climbed out and lifted his hands theatrically. "Road's slick," he shouted over the wind. "I lost traction. Nobody's going anywhere until it clears." The handler's eyes narrowed. He'd seen this before in different uniforms, different countries. The sudden accident that just happened to trap you in the wrong place at the wrong time. Behind them, the bystander with the phone kept recording, panning from the mound to the blocked exit, narrating under his breath like he was afraid silence would let the lie settle. "They're blocking us," he whispered, voice shaking, camera steady. "They're blocking." A figure brushed past him too close, shoulder bumping by accident, and the phone flew from his hand, skittering across crusted snow toward the ridge edge. The bystander lunged, panic flashing, but a boot came down near the device, not crushing it, just pinning the moment. "Careful," someone said with fake concern. "It's dangerous out here." Dangerous. Again. The handler's jaw set, and he keyed his radio to switch channels, but the air filled with a sudden wash of stepped-on transmission, a long, ugly carrier tone that drowned out his attempt like a hand over a mouth. Someone was sitting on the frequency. Someone wanted the ridge quiet. The narrator calls it what it is because euphemisms are how cover-ups breathe. Containment. Erasure. The deputy coordinator tried again, voice cracking with pressure. "We have orders." "We can't." "You can," the handler cut in softly. And that softness carried a weight that made heads turn. You're choosing not to. He took one slow step closer to the mound, planting himself between it and the men who wanted the mountain to swallow the evidence. The dog planted harder. Front paws splayed for traction, body angled to block, eyes locked on the nearest approach vector with an intelligence that felt almost indicting. No bark, no theatrics, just controlled dominance, the kind that says, "Cross this line and you'll have to do it over me." Wind screamed across the ridge, snow stinging like grit, and the storm excuse gathered force, a convenient curtain. "Last warning," the cold voice on the radio insisted through the interference. "Withdraw immediately." The handler looked from the blocked road to the pinned phone to the stepped-on channel, and he understood the full shape of the tactic now. Isolate the scene, cut the witnesses, force movement, let weather do the rest. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue with the storm. He simply stood where the truth was, steady as a marker in a blizzard. And in that steadiness, the power players discovered a problem they hadn't planned for. An unmovable man, a disciplined dog, and a moment already captured that refused to be erased. The thing about intimidation is that it only works in the dark, and on that ridge, while the wind tried to sandblast the world into silence, light found a crack anyway, because the bystander they'd treated like background wasn't background at all. He was a conduit. He scrambled after his dropped phone with shaking hands, scooped it up before the boot could accidentally shift, and backed away without a fight. Because fighting was what they wanted. An excuse, a scuffle, a reason to call him unstable. Instead, he did something cleaner. He opened his uploads, thumb moving fast despite the cold, and sent the footage into the one place their gate couldn't lock, the public eye. First went the clip from the trailhead, the clean-jacketed man pointing at the map, laughing off a missing worker as the kid, calling the search a waste, baiting the handler with that word slow. Then a second clip, radio audio, captured over wind, the oddly specific negative, not authorized, the tightening boundaries that made no sense for a rescue. Then the third, the one that made people's stomachs drop, the ridge drift, the dog freezing like a statue, the careful pawing, the soft collapse of snow into void. The handler's voice turning procedural. Potential concealed person. Potential evidence. Right before interference flooded the channel. The upload didn't need commentary. The story was on its face. And within minutes, the first shares hit like sparks in dry grass. People who lived in the valley recognized the lodge silhouette in the background and added their own whispers and comments. My cousin worked there. Not the first accident. They always steer searches away. Someone stitched the video with a date stamp and a blunt caption. One fatal mistake. And it jumped from local feeds to regional pages that lived for outrage, then to community groups that lived for protection. Notifications multiplied. Screens lit up in diners, in warm living rooms, in patrol cars. A local reporter, the kind who'd been ignored for years, saw a chance to force a door open and posted a teaser. Search turning into investigation? Then the bigger outlets sniffed blood, an alleged cover-up in a winter resort town. And suddenly the lodge man's clean smile wasn't a shield anymore. It was a thumbnail. Up on the ridge, while the online tide built, the handler made his own weapon out of something even older than the internet. Procedure. He photographed the mound from multiple angles with gloved hands, steady. Then photographed the seam in the basin, then the torn strap, then the blocked road, each image time-stamped and backed up to a device the officials couldn't log away. He dropped GPS pins and spoke them aloud to 2 team members, making witnesses out of ordinary people. He used chain of custody language on purpose. Do not disturb. Maintain perimeter. Document all contact. Because those words turn a messy moment into a record that can survive politics. When another stepped-on transmission tried to drown him, he switched to a satellite unit he'd kept clipped under his jacket. A quiet contingency learned the hard way in past lives. And he made a call that didn't travel through local hands. Down the slope, the SUV still blocked egress. The storm still pretended to be the reason, and the lodge man still hovered with his phone holder, smiling too hard. But the handler's calm had shifted the ground beneath them. This was no longer something they could solve by pushing people around. And then, like a scene change the mountain itself couldn't stop. Quiet vehicles appeared at the edge of the storm, unmarked, dark, moving with the steady patience of professionals who don't announce themselves. No logos, no friendly waves. Just doors opening in the wind and figures stepping out in weatherproof gear, faces set in the neutral expression of serious authority. They didn't care who owned what. They didn't care about reputations or peak season. They cared about facts. One of them looked at the mound, looked at the handler's documentation, looked at the dog holding its line, and said the first words that sounded like relief all day. You did the right thing. Now nobody touches anything until we take it from here. The storm never got the chance to do what it had been invited to do: cover, bury, erase. Because once serious authority took the ridge, weather became what it always should have been in the first place: a hazard to manage, not a narrative to hide behind. They cordoned the area with calm efficiency, setting stakes in tape that snapped in the wind, assigning hands to watch hands, eyes to watch eyes. And the handler watched the whole machine shift, from improvised search to controlled investigation, like a gear dropping into place. The dog was led a few steps back, praised in a low voice, then held steady beside the handler's knee, still alert, still reading the humans as the true variable. When they began to open the disguised cavity, they did it with care that bordered on reverence, small cuts, measured scoops, an understanding that whatever the snow was hiding had already been wronged enough. What they found confirmed what the dog had known all along. The missing seasonal worker wasn't lost to the mountain's indifference. He'd been hidden from it, tucked beneath a sculpted lie meant to buy time until wind and night could finish the job. The scene stayed mercifully non-graphic, but morally it hit like a blow. Evidence of restraint, evidence of deliberate concealment, evidence that someone had turned a human being into a problem to be stored. The lodgeman's voice, Dambosse, which had dominated the morning, tried to rise again at the perimeter. This is outrageous. You're overreacting. I have guests. But the words bounced off the investigators like sleet off stone. They weren't impressed by volume. They asked for access logs, work rosters, vehicle movements, radio records, gate codes. And that's when the dominoes started to fall, not in cinematic explosions, but in the slow, unstoppable collapse of lies under documentation. A maintenance supervisor, an older man with cracked hands and tired eyes, stood off to the side pretending he wasn't listening. But his face kept flinching at certain questions, and the handler noticed, because he'd learned that guilt has tells even when people try to swallow it. The supervisor went pale when they mentioned the basin seam, when they asked about who had keys to the storage shed near the service cut, when they wondered aloud why a search route had been suggested away from that quadrant. At first he mumbled what everyone mumbles: I don't know, I just follow orders. But the weight of the ridge, the tape, the cameras, the public outrage humming on, every phone in every pocket, crushed the old comfort of silence. He finally stepped forward and asked, voice shaking, if he could speak to someone, off the radio. They brought him to the lee of a rock outcrop, shielded from wind and eyes. And the truth poured out in the way truth does after too long in captivity. Halting, then faster, then unstoppable. He talked about payments that came in envelopes, about logs that were rewritten, about injuries that were reported as accidents, because the lodge couldn't afford disaster incidents, about a pattern that made his stomach turn but kept his family fed. He named names. He pointed to a ledger hidden behind a false panel in an office cabinet. He admitted he'd been told to clean the basin, to keep people away, to never, ever let the handler's dog near the service cut. He cried once, quickly, as if ashamed of the sound. Somewhere nearby, the lodge man's clean smile began to fracture under the sheer density of records, the kind you can't bully into disappearing. When they walked toward him with a clipboard and a calm request for his phone and keys, he tried one last theatrical protest. Hands spread, voice raised, lawyer's name thrown like a smoke grenade. But this time there was no deputy eager to please, no volunteer laughing along, no crowd frozen by power. There was only procedure. Questions, signatures, evidence bags, and then the quiet click of cuffs that sounded louder than any shout he'd ever used. Later, when the ridge was cleared and the mountain had resumed its indifferent patience, the valley felt different. Not because the snow had changed, not because the lodge's lights had dimmed, but because the lies had finally been forced out into daylight where they couldn't survive. The handler didn't give interviews. He didn't take victory laps. At the staging area, away from cameras, he knelt in the crusted snow, drew his dog close, and pressed his forehead to warm fur, eyes closed as if releasing something he'd been holding since the first growl on the ridge. The dog leaned into him, steady, present, uncelebrating. Two professionals acknowledging the job. And when the narrator closes the file on this day, it lands with the only lesson that matters. Quiet strength outlasts loud intimidation. Truth, documented and seen, is stronger than any bully with a badge or a wallet. And sometimes the difference between erasure and accountability is a disciplined dog who refuses to look away.